The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone plaza in front of Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered in clusters, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood James Wilcox, a 20-year-old royal guardsman who had served for 6 years. His red uniform was pristine, his black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his face remained stoic as hundreds of eyes watched his every move. James took his position with pride. This wasn't just a job to him. His grandfather had been a guardsman, and his father before him. The tradition ran deep in his blood. He stood perfectly still, rifle at his side, eyes fixed forward. Children pointed at him, trying to make him smile. Tourists snapped photos from every angle. But James didn't flinch. He had trained for years to maintain this discipline. Near the back of the crowd, a different kind of observer watched with darker intentions. Marcus Webb, a 32-year-old man with a history of violence and drug abuse, had come to London with chaos on his mind. He had been drinking since dawn, and the alcohol mixed with his anger created a dangerous combination. Marcus hated authority. He hated the police, the government, and especially the symbols of the monarchy that he believed represented everything wrong with society. As the morning progressed, Marcus pushed his way through the crowd. People moved aside, sensing the tension radiating from him. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic. He carried a metal pipe hidden inside his jacket, something he had picked up from a construction site the day before. In his twisted mind, he had decided that striking a royal guard would be his way of making a statement, of showing the world that these symbols of power could be hurt. James noticed the disturbance in the crowd, for he saw Marcus. Years of training had sharpened his awareness. He could sense when something was wrong, even while maintaining his ceremonial stance. His muscles tensed slightly, though his face remained unchanged. Other guards nearby shifted almost imperceptibly, their training kicking in as they prepared for potential trouble. Marcus finally reached the barrier that separated the guards from the public. He stared at James with pure hatred in his eyes. Several tourists noticed him and stepped back, sensing danger. A mother pulled her children closer. An elderly man reached for his phone to call for help. But everything happened too quickly. Without warning, Marcus pulled the metal pipe from his jacket and lunged forward, jumping over the low barrier with surprising speed and agility for someone who had been drinking all morning. The metal pipe swung through the air with deadly force. Marcus aimed directly at James's head, putting all his weight behind the blow. The crowd screamed in terror. Cameras dropped to the ground as people scrambled backward. Parents covered their children's eyes. The sound of the pipe cutting through the air seemed to echo across the entire plaza. But James was no ordinary target. His military training kicked in instantly. In a split second, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to block the attack with his ceremonial rifle, which could have been damaged and left him defenseless, James dropped low and twisted his body. The pipe missed his head by inches, hitting his bearskin hat instead and sending it flying across the cobblestones. Marcus stumbled from the force of his own swing. His balance was already compromised by the alcohol in his system. As he tried to recover and swing again, James acted with the precision of a trained soldier. He wasn't just a ceremonial guard standing still for tourists. He was a real military professional who had completed extensive combat training. James swept Marcus's legs out from under him with a swift kick. Marcus hit the ground hard, the metal pipe clattering away from his grip. But he wasn't finished yet. Rage and desperation fueled him as he tried to scramble back to his feet. He reached for the pipe again, his fingers just inches away from it. The crowd watched in horror, unsure if they should run or stay frozen in place. Security alarms began to sound. Other guards were already moving toward the scene. James could have easily subdued Marcus with force. He could have struck him, pinned him down violently, or used his rifle. But instead, something unexpected happened. James stepped on the pipe, preventing Marcus from grabbing it, and then did something that shocked everyone watching. He extended his hand toward Marcus, offering to help him up. The gesture seemed absurd in the moment. Here was a man who had just tried to seriously injure or kill James, and James was offering him a hand of peace. Marcus stared at the outstretched hand, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. His eyes were still filled with anger, but now confusion mixed with it. The crowd held its breath. Time seemed to stand still. Marcus's hand trembled as he looked between the pipe. Under James's boot and the hand offered to him, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to continue fighting, to lash out again. But another part of him, a part buried deep under years of pain and anger, recognized the humanity in James's gesture. For what felt like an eternity, Marcus remained on the ground, staring at James's extended hand. Tears began to well up in his eyes, though he tried to fight them back. His entire body shook, not from the fall, but from the overwhelming emotions crashing over him like waves. Nobody had shown him kindness in years. His life had been a series of rejections, failures, and violent encounters. And here was a man he had just attacked, offering him help instead of punishment. Slowly, hesitantly, Marcus reached up and took James's hand. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people began recording on their phones, capturing this extraordinary moment. James pulled Marcus to his feet with surprising gentleness. Once Marcus was standing, James didn't let go immediately. Instead, he looked directly into Marcus's eyes and said something that only those closest could hear. He said words that would later be reported by witnesses and spread across the world. James told Marcus that he understood pain, that he knew what it felt like to be angry at the world. He spoke quietly but firmly, saying that violence wasn't the answer, that there were people who could help, and that it wasn't too late to change course. His words were simple but powerful. They weren't rehearsed or planned. They came from a place of genuine compassion. By this time, security forces and police had arrived at the scene. They rushed forward to arrest Marcus, their hands reaching for him roughly. But James raised his other hand, signaling them to wait. He asked them to be gentle, to treat Marcus with respect despite what had just happened. The officers looked confused, but followed James's request. They handcuffed Marcus carefully, without the usual force used in such situations. As Marcus was being led away, he turned back to look at James one more time. Tears were now streaming freely down his face. His lips moved, forming words that everyone could see but barely hear. He was saying sorry, over and over again. The hatred that had burned in his eyes just minutes before had been replaced by something else. Something that looked like shame mixed with gratitude and confusion. The crowd remained silent for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire plaza erupted in applause. People were crying, hugging each other, moved by what they had seen. This wasn't the typical tourist experience they had expected. They had witnessed something profoundly human. A moment of mercy and compassion that transcended the violence that had preceded it. James retrieved his bearskin hat from where it had fallen and returned to his position. The videos of the incident spread across social media within hours. By evening, millions of people around the world had watched the moment when James offered his hand to Marcus. News channels picked up the story, running it as their lead segment. Commentators debated the meaning of what had happened. Some praised James as a hero, while others questioned whether he should have been more forceful in subduing the attacker. But for James, the attention was uncomfortable. He had simply acted on instinct, following his training and his own moral compass. When reporters tried to interview him, he declined, saying he was just doing his duty. His commanding officers praised his handling of the situation, noting that he had prevented further violence while also protecting the dignity of both the institution he served and the man who had attacked him. Marcus, meanwhile, sat in a police cell, his head in his hands. The alcohol had worn off, and reality crashed down on him with crushing weight. He couldn't believe what he had done. More importantly, he couldn't stop thinking about James's face, about the kindness in his eyes when he had every right to show anger. Marcus had expected to be beaten, arrested violently, and thrown away like the piece of trash he believed himself to be. Instead, he had been shown mercy. A court-appointed psychiatrist came to evaluate Marcus the next day. Dr. Sarah Chen was a woman in her 50s who had worked with troubled individuals for decades. She sat across from Marcus in the small interview room and asked him to tell his story. At first, Marcus was resistant, giving short answers and avoiding eye contact. But as Dr. Chen listened without judgment, something inside him began to crack open. Marcus talked about his childhood. About a father who had beaten him regularly and a mother who had abandoned him when he was 12. He spoke about bouncing through foster homes, about the drugs he had started using at 14 to numb the pain. He described the jobs he couldn't keep, the relationships he had destroyed, and the slow descent into the anger that had consumed him. By the end of the session, Marcus was sobbing, releasing years of buried pain. Dr. Chen made detailed notes and recommendations. She believed Marcus needed intensive therapy and rehabilitation, not just punishment. She argued in her report that what James had done at the palace, that moment of human connection, had opened a door in Marcus's heart that had been locked for years. It would be a waste to simply throw him in prison without attempting to help him heal. The judge assigned to Marcus's case read Dr. Chen's report carefully. Judge Patricia Morrison had been on the bench for 20 years and had seen countless cases of violence. Judge Morrison was known for being tough but fair. She believed in justice, but she also believed in rehabilitation when it was genuinely possible. The case of Marcus Webb troubled her deeply. On one hand, he had committed a serious violent offense in a public place, endangering not just the guard but potentially others in the crowd. On the other hand, the victim himself had shown extraordinary mercy. The psychiatric evaluation suggested that Marcus could be helped. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing. Media representatives filled the gallery, cameras waiting outside. James had been called as a witness, though he had tried to decline. When he took the stand, dressed in civilian clothes, he looked uncomfortable with all the attention. The prosecutor asked him about the attack, about his fears in that moment, about whether he believed Marcus was dangerous. James answered honestly, but carefully. He said yes, he had been afraid. Yes, Marcus was dangerous in that moment. But he also said something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He said that when he looked into Marcus's eyes, even as Marcus was attacking him, he didn't see evil. He saw pain. He saw a broken human being who needed help, not just punishment. He asked the judge to consider rehabilitation as part of whatever sentence was given. The prosecutor objected, arguing that James was being too lenient, that his compassion, while admirable, shouldn't influence justice. But Judge Morrison listened carefully to every word James spoke. She also listened to Dr. Chen's testimony about Marcus's childhood trauma and his potential for recovery. She reviewed letters from social workers and addiction counselors who had worked with similar cases. When it came time for Marcus to speak, he stood shakily, his voice barely above a whisper. He apologized directly to James, to the court, to everyone who had been frightened by his actions. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what he had done. He simply acknowledged his guilt and said he understood if he had to spend years in prison. But he also said something that made several people in the courtroom wipe away tears. Marcus said that James's act of kindness had shown him that he was still human, still worth saving. For the first time in his life, someone had treated him with dignity when he deserved none. That moment had planted a seed of hope in his heart that he thought had died years ago. He promised that if given a chance, any chance at all, he would spend the rest of his life trying to become the person that James had seen in him that day. Judge Morrison took a long pause before delivering her sentence. The courtroom held its breath. She acknowledged the seriousness of the crime and the need to protect public safety. Judge Morrison sentenced Marcus to 5 years in prison, but with a special condition. 3 of those years would be served in a secure rehabilitation facility that specialized in treating trauma and addiction. If Marcus successfully completed the program and showed genuine progress, the remaining 2 years would be suspended. It was a controversial decision that drew both praise and criticism from the public. Marcus was transferred to Riverside Recovery Center, a facility 2 hours outside of London. The first months were incredibly difficult. Withdrawal from drugs was physically painful. Therapy sessions forced him to confront memories he had spent years trying to forget. There were nights when he wanted to give up, when the old anger threatened to consume him again. But he kept thinking about James's hand reaching out to him, about those words spoken with such genuine care. 6 months into his treatment, Marcus received a letter. It was from James. The guard had written to say that he believed in Marcus's ability to change, that he was proud to hear about the progress being made. James shared some of his own struggles, about the pressure of military life, about losing friends in service, about his own journey to find peace. The letter wasn't long, but every word meant everything to Marcus. He kept it under his pillow and read it whenever doubt crept in. As months turned into a year, then two, Marcus transformed. The angry, violent man who had attacked a guard was becoming someone else entirely. He earned his high school equivalency diploma. He trained as a peer counselor, helping other men in the facility work through their trauma. He learned carpentry skills in the workshop. Most importantly, he learned to forgive himself, slowly and painfully. Day by day. 3 years after the incident, Marcus walked out of Riverside as a free man, having completed his sentence. He was 35 years old and starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bag of possessions. But he also had something more valuable: hope, skills, and a support network. The facility helped him find a job at a construction company whose owner believed in second chances. On the anniversary of the attack, Marcus returned to Buckingham Palace. He stood in the crowd watching the guards in their ceremonial positions. Tears ran down his face as he remembered the person he had been. A tap on his shoulder made him turn around. It was James, off duty, dressed casually. The two men stared at each other for a moment before James smiled and extended his hand once again. This time, when Marcus took it, they shook firmly and then embraced. They walked to a nearby cafe and talked for hours. James told Marcus about his life, his family, his hopes for the future. Marcus shared his journey of recovery and his dream of one day helping other young men avoid the path he had taken. They talked about starting a program together. Using their story to inspire change, their friendship became a symbol of redemption and forgiveness that inspired millions around the world.